Most of the viewers who watch this video, including me, live in fairly developed countries that do not know the concept of hunger. We go to supermarkets and take from the shelves the necessary amount of food that does not allow us to starve. But such a banal level of comfort for us is not available to everyone. According to a 2020 data, 7 million people die of hunger every month on the planet. Of particular concern is the situation in countries in Africa and the Middle East, such as South Sudan, Ethiopia, Madagascar, and Yemen. There were 570,000 people living in conditions close to starvation in 2021. The Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that between 2022 and 2023, the number of undernourished people worldwide could increase by 8 to 13 million. Food shortages are even more palpable because of Russia's war against Ukraine. According to authorities in Kyiv, several million tons of grain cannot be exported from Ukraine because of the war. Nevertheless, the state is doing everything to prevent a global food crisis. How does Ukraine, at the most difficult moment of its independent history, try to prevent the famine of the 21st century? Find out in our video. Prior to Russia's full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022, Ukraine was one of the top 5 global exporters of grains and pulses. In 2021, the country became a member of the UN Committee on World Food Security. According to the data for 2020-21, food exports from Ukraine amounted to 16.6 million tons of wheat, 4.2 million tons of barley, 18.4 thousand tons of rye, 23.1 million tons of corn, and also 126.9 thousand tons of flour. Among the countries most dependent on the supply of Ukrainian grain, the top 5 are Pakistan, share of Ukrainian grains 67%. Lebanon, the country buys half of its grain in Ukraine. Libya, 41% grain, Ukrainian. Tunisia and Ethiopia, in Ukraine they buy 36% of their grain stock. Large importers of Ukrainian wheat also include Egypt, Turkey, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. Ukraine's contribution to the global food market in 2021 was equivalent to providing food for about 400 million people. For comparison, the population of the USA is 330 million. Germany is about 84 million. Ukraine, thanks to its traditionally strong food exports, has long been positioned as a guarantor of food security in many countries of the world. The export of already prepared grain is closely related to the problems of logistics. Usually, 90% of grain from the fields of Ukraine is sent to world markets by sea. Russia, having occupied the southeast of Ukraine, blocked the country's key export hub, its deep-sea ports on the Black Sea. The 5 seaports leading in terms of grain transshipment, which provided 92.6% of the total turnover of these cargoes, were under the threat of missile attacks. These are Mykolaiv Sea Commercial Port, 28.1% of all grain transshipment via ports. In 2020, for example, this was over 12 million tons. The seaport of Chornomorsk, 27.9%. Pivdenia Seaport, 18.9%. Odessa Seaport, 13.6%. The specialized seaport Olivia, Port of Olivia, 4%. In addition to large volumes of transshipment of products, Ukrainian seaports charged a moderate price for it. In pre-war times, the cost of transshipment via deep-sea ports averaged about $11 per ton. Before the start of the war, monthly grain exports exceeded 5 million tons, of which Ukraine can export up to 0.6 million tons of grain per month by rail, and it costs 4 times as much. With grain carriers on automobile chassis, things are even worse. The carrying capacity of the vehicle is 15 tons. It will take 1,700 of these trucks to replace just one of the grain carriers. The war changed everything. The total blockade began with the frightening actions of the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Federation, which on February 25th ostentatiously shot several merchant ships near the port of Pivdenia. On March 3rd, on the roadstead of the Odessa seaport, the ship Helt under the flag of Panama was fired upon and sank. Due to the constant threat of landing on troops on the coast of Odessa in March to April, all approaches to the city and the port from the sea were mined by the Ukrainian armed forces. In the ports of Odessa and Mykolaiv regions, 70 ships were actually stuck. The crew were evacuated from them. By March 7th, the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Federation mined the approaches to the mouth of the Danube and the area near Snake Island beyond the territory of 12-mile coastal zones. And by the 19th, the Russians mined the sea routes from the Bosphorus to Odessa. Kyiv, Odessa, Chornomorsk, and Pivdeny, the main strategic ports for the export of Ukrainian agricultural products, were under blockade. The less important ports of Berdyansk and Kherson were occupied. After 80 days of heroic resistance, the port of Mariupol was also captured. Minefields and the permanent threat of missile attacks on ports and ships located in the affected area made it impossible to export grain from Ukraine and put the world on the brink of a food disaster. Russian authorities use food terror as a lever to lift sanctions that undermine the economic potential of the aggressor country. But Ukrainian agrarians are determined to fulfill contractual obligations. Harvesting and sowing campaigns in Ukraine have turned into a battle no less dramatic than the fighting. According to the Defense Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Russian troops are deliberately destroying grain stocks and conducting aimed fire on agricultural equipment. Direct hostilities continue in Slobozhenщina, Zaporizhzhia, Transnistria, and Tavria, which are the key agricultural regions of the country. Ukrainian farmers say they will harvest anyway and need a place to store it. But since last year's grain is stuck, there are not enough hangars. The EU may install some portable storage facilities, and US President Joe Biden has proposed building storage facilities along the Polish border to make it easier to move grain over land. Storage is costly for farmers, especially if it is unclear whether they can sell their grain. Operators are now building new supply chains and trying to increase export flows through the last remaining shallow ports in the south of the country, as well as through railway communications and checkpoints on the border with the EU countries. These efforts made it possible to receive the first batch of corn from the Romanian port of Constanta. But can other exporters fulfill their contracts in the same way? After all, even if you could load more, it still requires more time and more logistics costs. The latter have already jumped sharply amid strong demand and are also putting pressure on Ukrainian grain prices. If Ukraine wants to remain competitive in the global market, all increased costs must be included in the price. And it turns out that the cost of cargo transportation from the central part of Ukraine to the port of Reni or Izmail, which are located on the border with Romania, is about $65 per ton, which is twice the pre-war level. The cost of rail transport has also increased by $10 to $30 per ton since the beginning of the war. The reasons are huge delays and forced rerouting after rocket attacks on the railways. Grain also has to be reloaded at the border due to the different widths of the railway lines in Ukraine and the EU. Traders are forced to pay additional costs for the delivery of grain to European ports. Thus, the cost of loading barges from Reni or Izmail to the port of Constanta is about €26 per ton, a jump of more than €15 since February. Delivery of grain to Romanian ports by rail is likely to cost even more, as shipping through Romania alone will cost €16 to €25 per ton depending on the distance. And this is in addition to transit costs for goods passing through Moldova, which increased from $15 to $36 per ton. Approximately the same cost exists for Poland since the logistics costs from the Ukrainian border to Polish ports are about €36 to €40 per ton. And this does not include transshipment at the port. Thus, exporters will have to make a discount of at least €65 per ton in price in order to be able to compete on the world market by selling Ukrainian grain. As you can see, all these solutions are a band-aid for a gaping wound. The real way out is to open the ports. Turkey mediated negotiations with Russia on ports, relying on a proposal from the United Nations to create a safe corridor for the transport of grain. Thanks to the professionalism of Turkish diplomats, a fragile truce was reached. The deal provides for a ceasefire and partial demining. Grain can be shipped from 3 Ukrainian ports escorted by Ukrainian ships, while a ceasefire regime will operate within geographic limits. In order to prevent the transportation of Western weapons by sea, the Turkish Navy will check ships bound for Ukrainian ports. The parties agreed to establish in Istanbul, under the auspices of the UN, a coordination center responsible for controlling the supply of Ukrainian grain and monitoring the level of threats to grain carriers. On the morning of August 1st, the Minister of Infrastructure of Ukraine announced that the vessel Razoni, under the flag of Sierra Leone, had left Odessa with 26,000 tons of Ukrainian corn. At the time of writing the text on August 4th, the joint inspection team has completed an inspection aboard the Razoni. According to the Ministry of National Defense of Turkey, the ship will pass through the Bosphorus and go to Lebanon. According to the Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food of Ukraine, Mykola Solsky, 18 million tons of old grain crops need to be exported from Ukraine. Another 40 million tons for export are expected from the new harvest. Will such a fragile truce ensure such a huge amount of exports? The question is open. But the fact that, due to the aggressive policy of the Russian Federation, grain prices will increase significantly does not raise questions. The main problem is whether the developing countries that are so dependent on Ukrainian grain, where millions of people were starving even at the old prices, can afford to buy grain at higher prices.